So Richard, let's start with you. You've been working on this issue for quite some time now. When did you start your reforms, and what was your goal when you started this?
Thanks, Sarah. A word about where I work. First of all, it is a jail, and there's more people actually in jails in America than in prisons, as Mitch Lucas, who's the head of the American Jail Association, as part of our group, has pointed out. And but it's a jail that keeps people people wind up at for a fair length of time. It's a fairly atypical place in terms of the credentials of its administrator. 40 years ago, the chief administrator was the first master of social work ever to be elected sheriff in the United States, and set about to try to make it really about corrections and not about warehousing. And really about everything was, the whole idea was balance, strength reinforced with decency, firmness dignified with fairness, and our purpose was to give people the tools and directions to build a law-abiding life. And we built that model, but in 2008, 7 years ago, we looked around, and we had a draconian solitary confinement unit like everyone else. Our jail within a jail that we had slid into had become not consistent with our whole philosophy and our whole effort. So we set about to reform to change that. And what we did was, first of all, there's been talk about bringing the staff along in this and staff obstruction to it. We in-charged staff, with myself as the administrative liaison, to design the changes. Every level of staff, uniform and non-uniform, sort of an entrepreneurial empowerment kind of way of getting staff buy-in. They thrashed it out for 10 months, made some proposals, and we implemented them. And they roughly, I can break them down into some broad categories that I think any reform in one way or another is going to include, not to say that it's going to encompass any possible reform, but I think first of all was the staff buy-in that I talked about. Second of all was to reduce the amount of people sent to segregation through alternative sanctions, intermediate sanctions, etc. The third was to make the unit an attempt to deal with pathology as opposed to give it a home and foster it. That it wouldn't be it wouldn't contribute to stagnation and frustration and bitterness and anger. And so we implemented gradual positive reinforcements in terms of conditions. We actually implemented MP3 players on the unit, which for some of you aren't familiar with them. They're essentially electronic books, and we could put programs in them, meditation in them, prayer in them, soundscapes in them, music in them, to work against decompensation. We instituted a good time policy where they could take time off their disciplinary sanction, just like in the main institution. We brought programs there. We put in an exercise cell that they could earn being in by themselves with an open door and different exercise equipment. And we instituted a step down, as people have talked about, into general population. The results are that 7 years later, so we've been at it a while, we have a 68% less people in segregation on any given day, spending 70% less time. Our numbers aren't as good as Rick's, but we're at 1.8% of our population. It is in any given time, and which represents about a 50% reduction for us. The climate on the unit has changed. Staff is healthier and about working there, and we have not had any increase in violence in the main institution. At that amount of reduction, 68% and 70% less time, it has not affected the main institution in terms of any increase in violence. So what we've learned is that you can slide into things, as people talked about, and you can get out of them if you take a look. Basically what we did was attempt to mirror our larger philosophy in that unit. I think all of the correctional practitioners maybe agree with everyone. We'd like to think of the day where you never needed a special unit for people who are particularly problematic. But until that day comes, our job is to make those units positive, humane attempts to work with a human being as opposed to drag them down into suffering and decompensation and deterioration.
Thank you. So Vera's had the opportunity to work with both Washington and New Mexico for the past several years on your efforts to reduce your use of segregation. So I'm going to throw the same question out to both of you, and we'll start with Bernie first. Since that time and since the partnership with Vera, what have you been up to? What have you been working on? What are the results that you've seen? What have been the strategies that you've employed in order to reach your goal?
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Good morning. It's great to see so many people here who are all interested in continuing the reforms around segregation and restricted housing. It's been almost an hour and a half this morning and no one has done a PowerPoint, so I'm going to have a few slides because I think that Rick and others did a great job of framing the issue, and then it's really what do you do within your system to actually reform it. So at one time, this was thought to be progress in segregation, cages, and better than certainly solitary confinement, where your only communication was through a little crease in a door. But what I want to talk about for a few minutes is a much different state within restricted housing, our most intensive management unit, of what kind of services you can provide and for that high-risk population. But I'll start, we all have our own pathway to this work, and mine started 35 years ago at the state penitentiary, where my first job out of college was to work in segregation and death row. And this was in 1980, and it was just horrific conditions. And from that experience, really it led me to a personal and professional commitment to reform. That if you can reform the deepest end of your system, then the rest becomes much more achievable. So there's a lot of advancement in the field since I started in the correction system 35 years ago. We understand risk a lot better. We understand offender needs. And we also understand responsivity. How do we engage with that population? So Washington State, it's a progressive state, supports research and evidence. And we know that it's not a one-size-fits-all corrections environment anymore. And what we wanted to do is look at who's in segregation and why are they there. And actually engaged Vera 4 years ago and did an assessment of our population, and there's no surprises that there was 23% of our population are gang entrenched, but in segregation it was 69%. Our mental health population in the system was 13%, and in segregation it was 40%. So we saw those that were the highest risk population, that in order to transition them, we had to develop strategies and that in some cases caused them to actually be in that environment. So we built a programmatic model, and I guess the tenets of that model are that we move away from suppression and containment, where we're focusing on programming. We move away from segregation as punishment, but we use it as a tool to manage our facility safely. That it's not a one-size-fits-all. We look at the individual needs of the offender, and it's not a time structure. You're not there for X amount of time. You're there based on you changing your behavior and transitioning back to the population. So this is too complex for me to talk about now, but it takes a specific strategy. And what we did with each of those subpopulations is create within our prison system programs targeting that population, developing interventions, and then transitioning them back. And I'll just talk about a couple quickly. This is the what we call the mock program at the state penitentiary. For those inmates who are most gang entrenched, it uses evidence-based cognitive behavioral programs to deal with aggression and violence. There's a 4-phase component on behavior change, and it also has incentives for them based on positive behavior. So what you'll see in the bottom picture are actually people from different gangs, from Norteños and Sureños, who normally would never be in the same environment together. And through the course of this program, have really gone through some significant changes and actually transitioning back to the prison environment, the general population. This is another example in our Monroe facility, our RAP program for those who are mentally ill and providing specific, more clinical strategies, cognitive behavioral, case planning, and a much more intensive management by our clinical staff. Again, they are people with a mental health diagnosis, but also are very aggressive in the system and have either assaulted staff or other inmates. So it's a means of transitioning them back to the general population. Just we asked, there was a question earlier about what's the evidence show, and there's a lot of concern that if you implement these programs, then use of force goes up, violence goes up, and there's a series of slides. I don't have time for them, but it shows use of force is down, grievances are down, and what the kinds of expectations people had of not creating a safer system is actually not true, that it does create a much safer environment. And this is the third program that I'll mention. These are for people who churn in and out of segregated environment because of behavioral issues. And this is more of a long-term program, 6 to 9 months, that engages those with very specific cognitive behavioral interventions. We had this program in place for a number of years. We've had 131 graduates and 107 have not returned to restricted housing environments. So I'll take an 80% success rate any day, and I think that it's a compliment to staff who've been able to implement this successfully over a period of time. And one last comment, because I think it's come up a lot about how do you engage staff in this process, and they really have to be part of the problem, part of the solution. It was, I think, very exciting for me to get a response from staff who have worked in segregation that their interest was similar to ours, that they didn't like the environment. They didn't like going to work and seeing violence and people locked down. And so they really, the model that I've talked about was in large part created by staff. Staff were trained, correctional officers were trained to deliver cognitive behavioral programs. Their investment is, I think, extremely positive and understanding strategies around motivational interviewing, engaging people, and actually communicating. So very much a part of our reforms is how we engaged staff.
Thank you. Gregg?
Same question, right. So New Mexico, let me first open up by thanking you each for caring enough to take the time out of your day to be here, and also caring enough to allow a fellow like me to be with you here today. To respect the workforce that I've asked to walk alongside of us in this change, and they've had to confront a lot of discomforts in how they've done business for many years, and they've done it well, and they've maintained what they needed to do while doing it. Let me just say, we started off a great deal worse than most people start off, and the reason that we started off a great deal worse dates all the way back 3.5 decades, February 2nd, 1980, when New Mexico suffered what still sits to be probably one of the most bloodiest, tragic riots in the history of this young nation. And what we did is we built, for 3.5 decades, we built a prison system based off of something that we wanted to prevent forever. We never once wanted to have the dubious distinction of that riot in our history again. And so inadvertently, well, good things grew out of it. People paid a little bit more attention to the prison system, but inadvertently and unwittingly, quiet, safe, event-free prisons became our single measure of success. And the way that you do that, as you've heard from others, is you just kind of lock them down. And so as a result, when we began to walk alongside of Vera, or together in this mission, we saw that we had a great deal of room to improve. And I'll tell you now, before we get into the details, we're still not a perfect system. But I can look at you today and say, because of the efforts by many, many wonderful men and women from Vera and this organization, and we're a heck of a lot better than we were just a couple of years ago. We started with well over 10% of our prison population in segregated environments, and we've cut that that percentage in half. And we've done that basically by looking at what our main drivers are. I mean, we've had to look at how we were working discipline. It was very confusing. When we first started looking at this, and although the folks from Vera who walked alongside of us, no one could tell the difference between disciplinary and administrative segregation. It just got confusing because we weren't watching how they got in there, and we certainly weren't building any methods to get them out of there. So we had to look very closely at that. When I first got there, I asked, what does segregation look like? In other words, how many people are in segregation that are just there because they're being protected? And the answer was 75% of everyone held in segregative environments were there because we needed to protect them. And so we needed a lot of work in that particular area. And then we've got a central, pretty vibrant issue of gangs in the Southwest to begin with, and certainly within our prison system. So while we've got some programs that, well, actually one that I stole from Bernie that he covered, the Managing Offender Change Program, that's worked really well, and I could talk all day about how excited I am about that. I won't spend time there because you've seen the chairs and you see kind of the basic structure that I plagiarized from him. I think it's only illegal in college, plagiarism, and I'm happy to do it. So what I would like to do, though, is I'd like to talk a little bit about the gang issue. We started a restoration of population program, and just like a lot of things in my life, I underestimated how it might work out. And the idea is that what we had done in those decades that followed that riot, we had looked at gangs and we had managed them just based on a group identity exclusively. And so we weren't separating. So what we knew we had to do was take kind of a predatory approach to how we were dealing with our gangs. So if you're a predator and you're preying upon other inmates and the staff, then there'll be a different route for folks that are simply, as we call it, clicked up in a gang. And so when we looked at that, we started this restoration of population program and said, hey, look, anybody here that wants to turn away from that, you're not active in your gangs, if you want to turn away from it, rather than segregation being the answer, we want to create another holding a special management unit for you where we can deliver your program and you can get the visitations, you can do those sorts of things. I can't tell you, ladies and gentlemen, how badly I underestimated how popular that would be. We really had gotten some resource problems just trying to figure out how to fund this thing. So it's been widely popular, and we're very proud of that. The protective custody, again, I mentioned 75%. It's now, we still got a few that we're working to get out of there, but we're down to about 7% of our segregation environments having folks in there that we are needing to protect. We've got a step-down release program. Because what we were doing was simply I was sitting in my chair, folks like me were sitting in their chairs and saying, listen, this quiet prison thing is important. This is how we survive. We don't want another riot. Then it was okay for us to simply leave people in segregation, and as Shaka pointed out, and many others have, and then just when they get ready for release, just release them back in our neighborhoods. And then we had the luxury, right, of scratching our heads, loading up our finger, cocking it, and pointing it at the police when they went out and hurt somebody else. And so we knew we had to stop that. So we now have a step-down program. I'm getting the dreaded card. We now have a step-down program that 180 days out, we start to transition them into special management units, making sure that they have more congruent movement programming consistent with their release. One last thing, we also approached drug trafficking in the prison system as a, it was the nail, and we just had a hammer for it, and that was segregation. And so we now have stood up because drug trafficking is a problem for us all, a program that is a special management unit where they get specialized programming there in lieu of going to segregation when we have those types of events there. So we can use questions. I don't want to get in trouble with Mary for any other information, but that's kind of a snapshot, I think, of some of the programs that are specific to our needs in New Mexico. So thank you.
Thank you. So, Reverend, you come at this work obviously from a very different angle. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your work and the community that you work with, as well as the role you see yourself and others playing in these reform efforts.
Yeah, thank you so much. Am I on? Am I on? I don't
Yeah.
think I am. Here, I'll borrow. Thanks, Gregg. As I've been listening, I'm not so sure I come at this from a much different approach, because I'm hearing some examples of courageous moral leadership all day here. And you don't have to wear a collar to provide moral leadership in this country. And so I think so many people have addressed the human dignity approach, which was in a sense kind of a sub-theme, but it actually to me has been a main theme of what we're talking about here. This group of people in this room recognizes that we're dealing with real human beings who have been and are being seriously mistreated. In our case, the extreme isolation that characterizes solitary confinement in this country constitutes torture. And we've recognized that. And what we're doing is lifting up a moral crisis that exists in major institutions that are in all of our communities. We're lifting this up and saying, call on me, I'll do something to try to help. Whether you're a researcher, you're working in public policy, whether you're running the system, whether you're a faith leader, people are standing up to be counted on this issue. It is, I think, increasingly one of the more recognized moral crises of our day. And it wasn't this way a few years ago, but I think it is now. And then there's that profound theological statement that was made earlier by Rick Ramish. What the hell are we doing? Or maybe that was Obi-Wan Kenobi. One of you said that. I don't know, but see, that's practical wisdom from where you sit that really does match up with what the Pope says. When the Pope says this extreme isolation of human beings is a sin against humanity. So it matches up. What the president said, although it wasn't in theological terms or moral terms, talked about it doesn't make sense to do this. So there's broad recognition, and I just want to say in our interactions with folks at the state level, because our organization started working very intensively on this, and the faith community's been in this for a long time, but we started working intensively for about 3 years ago. I like to think that we can be in the communities, in the states that you're working, and we can have your back a little bit, because we know that when you take moral leadership, it doesn't come without a price, and it doesn't come without a consequence. But the faith community can actually stand and say, this needs to be done because we're trying to distinguish between right and wrong. We're not trying to save money, although it does. We're trying to do the right thing by people who've been wronged for a long time, and these are the leaders that we can back. So I want to close with one other, well, I'll have a chance to bring more up, but one of the things when all the Pope events, the guy that was here just a few days ago, yeah, that guy. All the Pope events that I went to. One, Senator Tim Kaine reminded us that one of the comments that the Pope had made earlier is that we need to be islands of mercy in a sea of indifference. Now, when you think about who washes up into the shores of the prison system, the last resort spot. And it's not just that. I mean, it's people that are also victims of unfair sentencing law and other things. But these are really the ones that nobody wants and hand them over. Out of that sea of indifference, can we challenge ourselves to look at our prison system as islands of mercy? I don't know if that's a driving concept for you, but you would have to start by making sure you got the solitary confinement system extracted, where you had segregation without the extreme isolation, and then you could build from there. I really believe that we have the chance to do that together.
Thank you for that. And so you mentioned the Pope's last visit, and he visited a local jail in Philadelphia, and Nick had mentioned the president visiting a federal prison recently. and all the reforms you guys are doing, I'm wondering, and I'll start with Rich, but I'll let others kind of join in. How are staff responding to both the attention that this has been receiving out in the public, as well as the changes and reforms that you all have instituted? They're such a key part and component to these things actually playing out into the institution. So just wondering how staff are responding and taking a hold of this.
Thanks, Sarah. First, I missed one point on the essential elements that the professor talked about earlier, that segregation units are not used as mental health units, and that mental health problems are extracted out of problems of peer behavior. But in terms of staff and the general public, I think that if the truth be told, there's this stereotype about corrections. We see it all in prison movies with the corrupt warden and the brutal, sadistic cretin guards and the prisoner, Clint Eastwood, who when he's out on the street is a cop, but when he's in, then somehow he becomes a prisoner when he's in jail. And I think what we have to do is communicate to the public that as we do reform and as we do change, that it's balanced and sensible. Every time, the chief administrator, he's elective office, and one of the things we say to the public is the way to do this thing is with a prayer book in one hand and a 45 in the other. Sorry, Father. And I think the public wants to know that there's common sense along with the humanity, that some of the best changes can be made when you're sure that you're grounded in reality. You're going to reach for the idealism and the stars, but you're firmly grounded in reality, and the staff has to feel that way. Yeah, the foundation of any correctional institution may be safety, security, and order, but if that's all you do, it's not even worth it, the job. You have that as a foundation, and then you put in the efforts for a human being to change the course of their life, and the humanity and the respect for everyone within the institution, the lawfulness. So the sum total of that answer is the public, the staff have to understand that it's rooted in reality and common sense, and then you build from there.
Just quick comments, because I did talk about it a little earlier. Our staff want safe facilities for themselves as well as those under our care, and they want safe communities. And I think it certainly makes sense to them that if you lock people up and they have no contact with an individual, whether they go back to a general population or the community, that's not safe for anyone. So I think that there's a tremendous amount of support for our staff of not only the humanity of it, but also that it brings more safety to the work that they do every day.
And if I could, let's talk about a simple life truth here. Leading people given to our influence and supervision in those prisons is no different than leading people in our workforce. You rise or fall to the level of your expectations. And so it's our expectations that are put out there, and I've noticed that. I've noticed that very well. One of the things that we mentioned, and I won't take much time, but it turned out to be such a wonderful godsend for us, is that early into this, before we'd even embraced segregation, we went through some really deep strategic planning to redefine what our core values were, to make sure that our mission statement was driving behavior in our organization. And so as we walked into these difficult moments, we were able to look back at what we said were our core values, what we said our mission statement were, when we were questioning whether or not we were doing the right thing or not, and that was helpful. It was by accident, but it was helpful. I would always encourage people, if they're going to take it on, to do it on purpose.
And I'll say one thing. We have a solitary confinement cell that we built, which is 6 by 9, that we travel around the country and take to major conferences. And people spend 5 minutes in it, 2 minutes, whatever. And really, we have the sound and everything. And one of the questions we get from people, of course they feel like this is just unimaginable to spend 5 minutes, let alone 5 years in this kind of a situation. But one of the questions we get from people is, what does this do to the staff who have to be standing next to this all day long and know that this person is in there and doesn't get out? And I would love to see, and I don't know how we do this, I would love to see some of the staff start to speak out, because I think there are staff who may be the next wave of who can start to talk about this, about how this is good for the communities and good for our soul as a nation, good for themselves as a human being. I think that's something that we need, and I hope that those of us who have those contacts can think about starting to do that, because obviously your all voice is getting out. I mean, it's clear and it's good and it's really powerful. So I want to challenge us to see if that can be the next phase of who's talking about this.
Thank you. You know, we talk about reform efforts a lot, and a lot of times we talk about once we've been instituting these for a number of years and we're seeing some results, but the road to reform isn't always clean, can be very bumpy. And so since you've been doing these for a few years now, wondering if you have any lessons learned that others that are looking at wanting to take this on that you would want to share with them based on your experience.
You want to start? Go ahead. Okay. Wow. I don't know how I'm going to really get in trouble with the time lady here. I mean, because I could go on and on about the mistakes that I've made. Here's how I would frame it, though. Is you have to have the staff behind this. We can have all the great ideas in the world. I can fashion out policy. I can fashion out different systems and programs and structures, but they're all just legal junk if we don't have the real men and women who are doing this every day behind it. So there's a lot of time and effort that has to go in there. You can't pass up opportunities to celebrate small successes any more than you can pass up opportunities to make sure that you're exploiting crisis to your advantage, to make sure that you're messaging it right. And so I think if you go into this, the thing that I've learned is, just like if we're trying to lose weight, I mean, you look at a scale, you're wanting big results. But we've got to really, I mean, this is a long, tough process where we're at in this country, and we've got to be looking for those small successes every day to keep not only us motivated, but to make sure that we're sharing that with our staff to keep them moving forward.
And could I give a quick public policy answer on that? Because there are a lot of different directions that reform is coming from right now. And I know personally we have seminary interns and faith coalitions working in New Jersey on a model state bill that's hoping to move through their state legislature. The same would be true in the state legislature in New York, the HALT Act. We've got, you heard, there's a role for lawsuits and DOJ investigations. There's a lot in this mix that where it's coming from all different, I don't know, sometimes you must feel like it's coming from all perspectives, and maybe they're not all good. But I'm one that believes that if we mobilize people on the public policy issues and stay in this conversation, I think we'll figure this out. And we have to pursue a number of different paths, obviously. We work in about 10 different states. Sometimes it's on youth solitary bills, whatever, as ways to help push the agenda forward. And there's no one formula, and I don't know how you interact with some of those other strategies, but it's out there, and we're pushing it as a faith community.
So my perspective is, and guidance would be to be measured in how you do it, because one negative incident will set you back and have a lot of resistance from staff. Be measured and also measure. Staff want information, they want data. Our grievances down, our staff assaults down. I think you need to communicate what the impact of the reforms are. And then thirdly is to give staff the tools to do the work. You can't say, oh, we're going to change something next week without really providing them the right training and understanding what it is you're doing, whether it's how you engage people, whether it's specific programs that you're addressing to deal with aggression and violence. Is you have to look at this comprehensively and give your organization the right resources and the right tools to do it.
So I'll have one last question, and I'd like to start with the Reverend, and then please other people jump in. A number of people in the room are policymakers, advocates, the community. What role does that community play in the reform efforts? How can they help kind of be a part of driving the change?
Yeah, I think the early successes, Maine is one place, and other places where early on we actually got some results. The entire community was involved. The faith community was involved, the civil rights community was involved, the social workers were involved. I believe that that model is still there, and it's also needed because once the reforms happen, as you were mentioning, we don't want to backtrack. So I think we have a track record that's now getting built about how community engagement with great folks like these is actually getting the job done. We need more of that, and that's why I love the Vera process, because it helps to document the successes so that we can go out and show. And you've already talked about borrowing from each other. That's what we need to keep doing. But the community engagement piece has been instrumental from day one in this, and it's going to continue to be instrumental.
And if I might, one of
Here.
the things that struck me from 32 years of policing and coming into this is just how much people cared because they saw what I did every day in that former career, and how little they care about this. And so I would just add one more layer to that. It is so important to keep this dialogue up in the community, because to the extent the community doesn't understand how important this is from a human dignity point of view, but from a point of view of their own safety, if this pesky little thing we call a constitution says that 96% of the people that come to prison are getting out, whether you like it or not. They're either getting out worse or they're getting out better. And so we've got to keep that awareness out there. So public dialogue, community stakeholders are so important. Folks, we need that in this corrections profession. We need that. It helps us shine that light behind those prison walls that we're trying to do now.
Well, I just final comment is that one of the things we believe in, and I think most correctional practitioners believe in terms of, for instance, community reentry, is that the least level of security that someone can be safely supervised on, the better their chances of successful community reintegration. And I think we got to take that same philosophy in dealing with disciplinary problems, that the least level of security that they can be held in that will be most conducive to their successful resocialization. And I think one of the things, and that can break down into concentrating on how many hours can they be safely out of the cell, and how do we fill those hours positively, instead of how many hours can we keep them in a cell and not have to worry about them, you know.
Bernie, one last, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think it's important to emphasize that as we talk about this, and there's been great leadership around the country of people, of correctional leaders moving restricted housing population to general population, but you can't think of it as a one-dimensional approach. It's not just moving people out. It's paying attention to a deterrent strategy of why are people going in the first place. And so that may be that you don't have adequate mental health services, and so you have a more volatile population. It may be that we're all struggling with gang entrenchment, and so what do you do to manage gang behavior differently so that it doesn't lead to violence and it doesn't lead to the only solution being some kind of restricted program. So it's great, a lot of progress in shifting that population back to a general population or the community, but it's really the pathway in that you have to focus on as well.
That's a good point.
Thank you. So I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. Just step up to the microphone and then I'll call on you. Why don't we start with the gentleman over here?
Thank you. I'm Joe Etter, and I'm from the Oregon Department of Corrections. And it's a privilege to be here. And I will apologize because sometimes it takes a while for my light bulb to turn on. So maybe I'm the slow one in the room. But I can't help but, after listening to our speakers here, to and having the opportunity to visit Washington State and see the positive interaction between the staff and the inmates in these classroom settings. We talk about the human rights piece, and then we've also talked about the staff piece. And in a correction setting, you know, we don't typically merge the two. But at least in Oregon, one of our initiatives is staff wellness. We've had a real high alarming rate of staff suicides. So for me, listening to and seeing the interactions, I can't help but wonder if they aren't tied together. Making these changes also, we've talked about the safety piece, that's the physical, But I can't help but thinking that that's also going to impact our staff wellness. Because what was negative going home, someone would reach out to the bottle or whatnot, you actually have an opportunity to go home and start feeling good about yourself. So I pose that as a question as to whether my thinking is maybe on track there or not, or what your thoughts are.
Sir, there's a thing in life that I call the law of reciprocity. If I'm walking down the street and I smile at you, what are the chances of you smiling back at me? So I think that that's part of the dynamic of how life in the world spins. And so I personally, I'm not a social scientist, but I would wholeheartedly agree with your assessment.
I'd just like to say that one of the things that's going to make meaningful work for staff has been pointed out again earlier, is not just process. It's what's our goal and product. It's sort of a simple sort of business proposition, and our goal and product is a human being less likely to reoffend. And if you put that meaning into work and then you find out how to do that, then you have a lot more meaning for staff in the work than if it's just to hold people.
Yeah, that's noble. That's a noble thing to do.
Thank you. Okay. It would help me to envision what the responses might be to 3 different situations, which I think are probably fairly common. The people involved all ended up in extended solitary confinement in my state. The first is one inmate who knifes another on the yard. The second is the inmate who was knifed. The third is a man who has schizophrenia, was taken off of his medication because he was experiencing stroke symptoms. While off his medication, he apparently threatened one of the health officials. All 3 of these ended up in solitary confinement, and I am wondering specifically what else might have happened.
Go ahead. I'm happy to, but go ahead, Gregg.
Yeah. Well, no, I generally, and Bernie, I'm sure can add to it. I think generally, and I said it yesterday, people have heard it. When you view everything in life as a nail, the only tool you got in your toolbox is a hammer. And so I think what you've described is exactly the sorts of things that have exacerbated this problem. You've categorized it in a neat anecdote about your state, but looking at mental health, we heard about that this morning, looking at discipline, and also looking at protective custody, because I'm sure those are the 3 drivers that landed each one of those individuals that you're talking about. So those are the areas that I think that we've had. Vera, I'm not here plugging Vera, although I love you to death, Nick, but they have, and their walk alongside of us has helped us look at that, and it's so frequently a force for the trees, man. I mean, you can do these things for so long that it just seems normal. And it just seems the way that you do business. And not until you have the courage to invite someone in to say, look, we're going to stand here and we're going to be willing to kick ourselves in the pants if we got it coming, that you can actually see how important it is to take those 3 examples and look at it and ask questions about it.
I guess what I would add is to first of all acknowledge it's really serious behavior. We have a responsibility to have a safe environment for those under our care and for staff. I think that when I talk about it not being a one-size-fits-all approach, there's the behavior and then there's the response to the behavior. And our strategy is to say what is it that was involved in that so that it doesn't happen again. And you don't create a worse environment by keeping them in a restricted environment for a long period of time. But were they on medication and they stopped taking their medication? Was there an issue in increased tension between gangs? What is it that contributed to that behavior, and try to address that rather than just having it be we're going to punish you because you did something.
specifically in the 3 cases, just and as been pointed out, Bernie pointed out, you'd have to get into specifics and things. But off the top of my head, the person who did the stabbing would be prosecuted in our system. It's among other things, jails and prisons should be lawful places because you're trying to impart lawfulness. He would be prosecuted and he would be separated out into disciplinary segregation. The second person would be treated medically, and if it was a protective custody situation, that would be addressed. It might not be. And the third person should be a mental health situation, and the one person that would surely go to disciplinary segregation, whatever form we make that, would be the one that stabbed another individual.
Thank you.
Thank you. Question over here.
My name is Barbara Owen, and I'm a member of the advisory board group in this very important initiative. And my role is always to ask, what about the women? So maybe the panelists could make some remarks about the specific issues surrounding women in solitary confinement.
What a remarkable question. Because what we tend to do, and I know that what we found ourselves doing, is going about managing women in our prison through a male gender dominated lens, because they take up most of the prison population. So it's just easy to kind of do this cookie cutter approach. And so what we found is that the way that we approach women, how we even classify them from a security point of view, from a risk point of view, a needs point of view, is something very much different, and it has to be driven through a gender specificity. And so as a result of that, I don't remember the numbers now, some of the folks here that were there when it was a problem may remember it, but we had a great deal of our women in segregative environments, and I know of none at this point. And we still got, like I said, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of gender specificity in our programming and those sorts of things, but I think the tendency for us is to just take that male gender dominated approach to it, and that's problematic. Yeah.
I would just add to that, we know that the pathway for women coming into the correctional system is different than men, and the more you can have trauma-informed care and other special training for staff to understand that will diminish will deter people from women actually being in segregation. I'm not sure we have any at this moment in Washington, but I think that it's connected to the broader environment and culture within the facility of how you address those issues before they lead to aggression.
On the issue of women, I just wanted to suggest, I was mentioning to Sara earlier that, I don't know if you're familiar with a study, you probably are, that when women work as correctional officers in institution, there's less violence in the institution, and not just against the women, against the men. So one of the answers around women is that, there should be more of them working in corrections.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here comes a tough question.
Okay, so it's not surprising that I'm going to ask you about resources coming from BJA, but is lack of resources an excuse for not doing this work, these reform efforts? And if you need resources, how do you get them?
Yeah, I think it's an excuse. I say that in sort of a generalized way, and I think Rick would probably have the same response, and probably Gregg. The work needs to be done regardless. So what we have done, because we've reduced our population 60%, is close units, and then we've redirected the resources to other services and other programs. So I think you just have to be creative. It doesn't take a dedicated pot of money, but I think that it requires some thinking through about how you can realign your resources to do it.
Anybody else?
I don't know that I could add too much to that. I mean, really, you are relegated in these positions to figuring out how to be a steward of your resources on steroids, because there's not a lot of people out there saying, hey, let's throw some money out to the prison system. It doesn't get votes. We all know that. And so it's it is just a process of trying to find out where you can carve out money, invest it, make a difference, get a good return on your investment, and then reinvest that money into it. So it is an excuse, although I could use a little bit more.
I was going to say, we won't
community-based infrastructure, I'll be honest with you.
We won't say no, Denise, if there's an opportunity for resources.
I was going to say acceptable excuse, I guess, but good answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman over here.
Trelane with Senator Schatz. So sort of building on the previous question, one of the most vulnerable and invisible communities for solitary is the trans community. So I wanted to know if you guys had any input on that, and if you've seen any particular problems, and if you have any particular solutions, especially PREA reform for enforcing existing guidelines. So thank you.
I would say again, similar that it's you will fail if it's a one-size-fits-all strategy. It involves training. It involves clear policy to make sure that everyone is safe in our facilities. And the more clear you are, I think, about training and preparing your staff, then and have clear policy, then I think that the more success you'll have. So I'm not sure I have a specific answer other than it should not be because of someone's sexual orientation, their gender, their race. None of those should be considerations for placing someone in a restricted environment.
Absolutely.
See if I can reach this. I'm Bonnie Tenorello from Prisoners Legal Services in Massachusetts.
Oh.
Just to follow up on the question about finding resources, we have some good data from the GAO report on the Bureau of Prisons. I think maybe from New Mexico, I might have seen some figures, but I'm wondering if there's more information out there on comparing the costs of running per prisoner costs in segregated confinement with general population, because BOP is kind of a lot of apples and oranges going on, and and I'm wondering how you feel in terms of the ability of the resources that are freed to really meet the needs to do rehabilitative corrections right, or if you feel like there's that, how much of the way that goes in terms of really providing the kind of environments that y'all have been talking about.
Sure. I guess what if you look at our staffing model, it requires 3 times as many staff to run a restricted program than it would be even our maximum, and 6 times as many staff as it would in general population. So I think that obviously the more you can narrow that of your population who's in a restricted environment, then you're able to free up resources. Now that's easy to say, and you have complex facilities that in many cases may have crowding to deal with, may not have the same capacity to realign their resources, the same authority by their funding source, whether it's the Congress or whether it's our state legislature. But I guess short answer to your question is it requires less resources if you're able to develop a strategy to manage the population different than in segregation. And then your challenge is how you actually realign it.
And I know that we're running out of time, but let's not forget the less obvious costs of overusing segregation and how that translates itself into crime victimization, and what those costs are to the rest of the country, to our communities, from reincarceration to adjudication, the costs of victimization and all those things that we can't forget. They're less obvious than that tactical impact, but they're very important.
Well, being from Massachusetts, we have, as you're aware, a very intensive kind of programming effort, which are thought of as expensive. But because we have a lot of our people in lesser security, we have 1/3 of our census at any given time outside the fences and day reporting. Our costs come around right about average for we've got a sort of the costs of a Mercedes inside the facility, but it's so much less expensive to have people in lesser security, has been pointed out, that if you have a holistic system like that, your net cost is not that great. So again, the lesser level of security you can have someone on is also an economic measure,
Thank you for that. So with that, we'll go ahead and close. Just a few remarks before I pass it on to Fred to close us out. You know, I really want to give kudos to the 6 jurisdictions that are currently working with Vera. They've raised their hand and said they want to be a part of this work. Some of them have already made some reform efforts, but they're really pushing themselves to go forward, to go further in those efforts. And it's my hope, and I know that there'll be, you know, the next round of experts that are up there telling you in a few years about the good work that they've done. You know, they're opening up their systems to really analyze it. We've heard from a number of even the questions today about the complex populations that we're using segregation to respond to. And we really have to, what someone recently told me, we really have to unpack that population so we can have not a one-size-fits-all approach, but really a targeted approach for all of the people that we're using this practice for. So thank you to the panelists, thank you to you all, and I'll pass it on to Fred to close us out.